The camera opens on a frozen wasteland, silent, endless, white. A line of skeletal men drags itself across the ice like ghosts. No banners. No drums. No army, just survivors. 6 months earlier, they marched into Russia as the greatest fighting force Europe had ever seen, 685,000 men from every corner of Napoleon's empire. When they returned, fewer than 10,000 could still carry a weapon. The wind howls across the frozen river. The men look less like soldiers and more like shadows, faces burned black by frostbite, beards filled with ice, feet wrapped in torn cloth. Behind them lie the bodies of those who fell asleep in the snow and never woke up. The world calls it the work of General Winter. But Winter didn't start this. Pride did. The scene flashes back to 6 months earlier, glittering eagles atop French standards, drums thundering, sunlight gleaming on tens of thousands of bayonets as the Grand Army marches across the Neman River in perfect formation. Hope, confidence, invincibility. This is not the story of a winter. It is the story of a man who believed he could bend an empire to his will. And the cost paid by those who followed him. This is the story of 1812, the greatest military disaster in Europe before the World Wars. You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story. What remained of the Grand Army, once the greatest fighting force Europe had ever seen, moved in a thin, broken line across the frozen Neman River. 6 months earlier, these same men had crossed in the opposite direction under bright summer sun, drums thundering, eagles glittering, convinced the world itself was bending beneath their boots. Now, the sunlight was gone. The music was gone. The men were ghosts. Some walked barefoot, their feet wrapped in strips of cloth torn from dead comrades. Others limped using broken muskets as crutches. Snow stuck to their faces because frostbite had turned their skin into a rough, dead surface. Many had lost fingers. Some had lost hands. A few had lost their sanity, murmuring to invisible companions or clutching treasures stolen from Moscow, gold icons, silk robes, now useless weights dragging them closer to death. This was December 1812. The end of Napoleon's greatest gamble. And the beginning of his downfall. French officers who had survived campaigns in Italy, Egypt, Austria, Prussia, veterans who had marched behind Napoleon for a decade, looked across the Neman in disbelief. They had seen war in all its forms, but nothing that resembled this. Of the 685,000 men who entered Russia, French, Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, Croatians, Portuguese, barely 10,000 crossed back in fighting condition. Another 30,000 stragglers followed in the days ahead, skeletal and frostbitten, unrecognizable as soldiers. Some crawled on hands and knees. Some didn't make it across at all. They collapsed on the ice and froze where they fell, their bodies joining the white graveyard that stretched across 1,000 kilometers of Russian wilderness. But here's what makes this moment so compelling. This was not a simple story of Winter defeating Napoleon. The catastrophe began months earlier, deep in the summer heat, long before the first snow. And the men crossing the Neman now paid for mistakes they never made. A Prussian general stood at the river, counting what remained of the army he had been forced to fight alongside. What he saw was not an army returning home. It was a migration of the dead. Men with faces blackened by frostbite. Men with frozen tears stuck to their cheeks. Men missing toes, feet, entire legs, amputated hastily with dull knives in the snow because there was no medicine left, no bandages, no surgeons. Russian Cossacks had shadowed the retreat for weeks, sparing any man who lagged behind. Wolves followed too, drawn by the smell of blood. Some soldiers swore they heard the howls at night, circling, waiting for the weak to fall. Whether this memory was real or a hallucination brought on by hunger hardly mattered, the effect was the same. Men pushed themselves beyond the limits of human endurance simply to avoid becoming prey. The Neman crossing symbolized the end, but also exposed the truth of the entire campaign. 6 months earlier, their crossing into Russia had been a spectacle of imperial power. Pontoon bridges stretching across the water like floating highways. Eagles raised high. Trumpets sounding. Napoleon riding at the head of 450,000 men in the central column alone. This return was different. No trumpets. No banners. No horses, because nearly all 200,000 horses had died long before winter, starved on the march. The few remaining animals were so skeletal that soldiers sometimes tied bundles of straw around their ribs to keep them warm. Even the officers looked broken. Gold braid torn, boots patched with scraps of cloth, cheeks hollow from starvation. They had lost their men, their equipment, their pride, and now they were losing their emperor too. Napoleon, once the man whose presence electrified entire armies, now sat hunched over in a sleigh, shivering, wrapped in layers of fur. He rarely spoke. He rarely looked anyone in the eye. The emperor who once reshaped Europe now looked as defeated as any private on the march. But why did this disaster occur? Why did the greatest army in Europe collapse? The easy explanation, the one repeated in textbooks and simplified documentaries, is winter. Russia defeated Napoleon. General Winter did the work. But this is a myth. The truth is far more complex, far more human, and far more tragic. The army had been dying in July, in scorching summer heat. Dysentery from contaminated water. Typhus spreading through lice-infested uniforms. Starvation because Lithuania and Western Russia simply could not feed 600,000 mouths. Exhaustion from marching 40 kilometers per day in pursuit of an enemy who refused to fight. By the time the first snow fell in October, Napoleon's army was already collapsing. Winter did not begin the catastrophe, it finished it. In the winter of 1812, as the last survivors limped across the frozen Neman, the world saw only the end of a catastrophe. But to understand how the catastrophe began, we must go back a decade, back to the moment when Europe trembled at the sound of a single name. Napoleon. To the common people of France, he was the man who ended the chaos of the revolution and restored order. To monarchs across Europe, he was a force of nature, brilliant, unpredictable, and terrifying. To his soldiers, he was the little corporal, the commander who ate with them in the mud, shared their hardships, remembered their names, and led them to victory after victory. By 1810, Napoleon stood at the peak of his power. His empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Russia. From the dunes of Spain to the shores of the Adriatic. No French king had ever ruled so much. No European monarch in centuries had been so dominant. But empires built on conquest are like fires, they must keep burning, or they die. And Napoleon's fire demanded more fuel. Many historians point to Napoleon's ambition as the cause of the Russian campaign, but the truth is deeper and more complex. His rise, his victories, and his relentless expansion created a Europe that lived in fear, admiration, and quiet resentment. Every victory forced him to seek another. Every peace he signed contained the seeds of the next war. By 1811, Napoleon was not simply an emperor. He was a prisoner of his own success. After Austerlitz in 1805, after Jena in 1806, after Wagram in 1809, Napoleon seemed untouchable. He defeated Austria, crushed Prussia, forced the Pope into submission, occupied Spain, and humbled every major continental power except one, Russia. Russia had signed the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, creating the illusion of friendship between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I. The two emperors met dramatically on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, smiling like brothers. But beneath the smiles lay suspicion. Alexander was young, idealistic, and believed he was chosen by God. Napoleon was older, hardened by war, and believed he was chosen by destiny. Two men who thought they were chosen cannot remain allies for long. The moment peace was signed, both leaders began calculating the next move. Napoleon needed Russia to enforce the continental system, a massive economic blockade designed to strangle Britain's trade. Britain was the only power Napoleon could not defeat on land, so he tried to starve it into submission. But the system hurt Russia's economy far more than Britain's. Russian nobles grew angry. Russian ports fell silent. Merchants grew poorer. By 1811, Alexander had quietly begun opening Russia's ports again. To Napoleon, this was not just betrayal, it was a challenge. A challenge to his pride, his authority, and his vision of controlling all of Europe's destiny. But even deeper than economic rivalry was something far more volatile. Fear. Napoleon feared Russia's rising power. Alexander feared Napoleon's unstoppable expansion. Both men believed the other would strike first. Both believed their empire would collapse if they appeared weak. Thus, the illusion of invincibility, Napoleon's greatest weapon, became his greatest trap. To maintain the appearance of strength, he had to keep expanding. To keep expanding, he had to confront Russia. To confront Russia, he needed the largest army Europe had ever seen. And so, the Grand Army was born. The scale of Napoleon's preparations was unprecedented. He assembled troops from 20 different nations, an empire's worth of manpower. 300,000 French. 100,000 Poles. 95,000 Germans from the Confederation of the Rhine. 30,000 Italians. 25,000 Austrians, reluctantly. 20,000 Prussians, forced. Swiss, Croats, Spaniards, Dutch, Portuguese, and more. It was less an army and more a continent marching under one man's command. To many Europeans, this seemed like divine fate. Who else but Napoleon could unite nations that had fought each other for centuries? Who else could shape the destiny of an entire continent? But beneath the glittering surface, cracks were already forming. Many of these men did not fight for France, they fought because they were forced to. Many nations marched unwillingly, resenting Napoleon's dominance. Communication was difficult, discipline fragile, loyalties uncertain. This was not an army of one people. It was an army of many peoples bound by fear, ambition, and coercion. And yet, Napoleon believed it was unstoppable. That belief, confidence bordering on delusion, drove him forward. He dismissed warnings from advisors, intelligence reports from the frontier, and letters from his own marshals urging caution. He convinced himself that Russia would beg for peace after a few battles. He convinced himself that Alexander would surrender rather than lose Moscow. He convinced himself that speed alone would win the war. Here lies one of the most important lessons in history. The higher a man rises, the fewer people remain who dare to tell him he is wrong. Napoleon had risen so high that even his generals, men who had marched with him for years, stood silent when they should have spoken. And so, in the summer of 1812, the greatest army in Europe marched toward the Russian frontier with drums beating, banners flying, and the weight of an empire behind it. They crossed the Niemen in June, confident, fearless, triumphant. 6 months later, the survivors crossed it again, but this time as shadows. To understand how such a mighty army turned into a column of ghosts, we must explore the moment where overconfidence, miscalculation, and imperial ambition collided with the vastness of Russia itself. By the spring of 1812, Europe felt like it was holding its breath. Diplomats whispered of war. Merchants hoarded supplies. Spies carried messages through forests and across borders. Every nation sensed what was coming, but none fully understood the scale of what Napoleon was preparing. Inside his palace in Paris, maps carpeted the tables. Every river, every road, every village between the Vistula and Moscow lay inked before him. The emperor paced restlessly, pushing pins into maps, moving figurines, calculating distances with mechanical precision. To Napoleon, war was geometry. Lines, angles, movements, speed. If the numbers worked, then victory followed. But war is not geometry. Especially not in Russia. Marshal Berthier, his brilliant chief of staff, tried to warn him, "The distances are too great, sire." Marshal Davout, the Iron Marshal, warned that Russia would not fight like Austria or Prussia, the Tsar will trade land for time. Even Caulaincourt, Napoleon's diplomat who knew Russia intimately, begged him not to invade. "The cold will kill us. The roads will break us. The country will swallow us." Napoleon listened. Then dismissed them all. For the emperor, hesitation was weakness, and weakness invited defeat. The tension between France and Russia sharpened through a series of political blunders and miscalculations. At the center of it all was a fragile alliance held together by pride, suspicion, and two emperors who believed they alone understood destiny. Miscalculation number 1, the marriage diplomacy. When Napoleon divorced Josephine and married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, he expected this would intimidate Russia. Instead, it frightened Alexander. Why? Because Austria, once Russia's ally, was now tied to Napoleon by blood. Alexander feared he was slowly being surrounded. Miscalculation number 2, the Polish question. Napoleon's support for a renewed Polish state terrified Russia. The memory of partitions was still fresh. The idea of Poland restored, especially with French backing, was a direct threat to the Russian Empire. Miscalculation number 3, the continental system. Russia's economy was collapsing under Napoleon's blockade of Britain. Russian nobles were furious, merchants bankrupt, and the Tsar himself losing patience. When Alexander reopened his ports to British ships, Napoleon saw it as a direct challenge. Miscalculation number 4, overconfidence. Napoleon believed Russia would collapse like every other nation had. He believed a single great battle would force Alexander to surrender. He was wrong. By May of 1812, the Grand Army began assembling on the Polish frontier, a sea of tents, cannons, horses, wagons, and soldiers. Never before had Europe seen such a force in one place. But the signs of disaster were already visible. Warning sign number 1, the supply nightmare. Napoleon's army was enormous, but so was the logistical burden. 600,000 men required. 2 million pounds of food per day. Tens of thousands of horses needing fodder. Thousands of wagons. Functioning roads. Stable supply depots. Nearby resources. Russia had none of these. Lithuania and the borderlands were poor, sparsely populated, and incapable of feeding such a force. Yet Napoleon ignored the warnings. The numbers looked fine on paper. He believed speed would compensate. Speed cannot feed an army. Warning sign number 2, disease was already spreading. Crowded camps meant lice, and lice meant typhus. Before the first French soldier even set foot in Russia, thousands had already died. Hospitals overflowed. Entire regiments weakened. A sickness Napoleon thought insignificant became the hidden killer that would take more lives than Russian bullets. Warning sign number 3, the Russians were preparing a different kind of war. Napoleon expected the Russians to defend their borders. Instead, they retreated. Alexander and his generals had studied Napoleon's campaigns. They understood that he crushed his enemies by forcing decisive battles early. So they refused to give him what he wanted. One Russian general's words captured their strategy. Let the French have space. Russia has space enough to bury them. On June 23, 1812, Napoleon arrived at the banks of the Neman River, the same river he would cross in ruins 6 months later. That night, he stood observing the water, silent and thoughtful. The men around him later said they sensed something unusual, hesitation. For the first time in his career, Napoleon paused before a major invasion. Perhaps he understood, deep down, that he was stepping into a world he could not control. Perhaps he sensed the immensity of the land he was about to challenge. Perhaps the silence of the Polish forests whispered warnings his pride refused to hear. At dawn on June 24, the Grand Army began crossing the river. Drums thundered. Eagles rose. Bayonets glinted in the sun. It was the greatest spectacle of military power Europe had ever witnessed. Napoleon watched in his gray overcoat, his face expressionless. Officers cheered. Soldiers waved. Bands played triumphant marches. But the emperor's mind was restless. He expected a Russian army to appear on the opposite bank. He expected resistance. He expected a battle. Instead, there was nothing. No gunfire. No enemy. Only empty fields and distant forests. The Russian army had vanished. This single fact should have changed everything. It should have made Napoleon reconsider his entire strategy. It should have forced him to slow down, rethink his supply lines, and adapt. But Napoleon took the empty border as a sign of weakness. He smiled. Russia does not wish to fight, he said. We will end this quickly. He could not have been more mistaken. For while Napoleon believed he was beginning a short, decisive campaign, Russia had already chosen a different kind of war. A war of distance. A war of space. A war of time. A war Napoleon's army was not built to survive. When the Grand Army crossed the Neman River in June 1812, the soldiers expected a battle within hours. For years they had marched under Napoleon with the same rhythm: enter a country, force a battle, crush the enemy, take the capital, end the war. That was the script they knew. But Russia did not follow that script. Instead of cannon fire, they found silence. Instead of enemy armies, they found abandoned villages. Instead of resistance, they found an empty horizon stretching endlessly ahead of them. It was the first sign that this war would be unlike any they had fought before. The French marched deeper, expecting the Russians to turn and fight at any moment. But every village they approached was already deserted. Doors left swinging open. Hearths cold. Fields stripped bare. Barns emptied or burned. Everything useful had been taken eastward or destroyed. The vast Russian countryside seemed to fold in on itself, swallowing every trace of life before the French could reach it. This was not an accident, it was strategy. Russia had decided to defeat Napoleon not by confronting him, but by denying him everything he needed to survive. The summer of 1812 was brutally hot. Dust rose in great choking waves as tens of thousands of boots marched over dry earth. Clouds of dirt trailed the army so thick that soldiers could barely breathe. Horses collapsed from heatstroke, men fainted under the sun, their uniforms stained white with salt from dried sweat. The air stank of rot, for the corpses of dead horses lined the roads, swelling in the heat, attracting flies in black, buzzing swarms. The Grand Army had not fired a single shot, yet it was already bleeding men at an alarming rate. The Russian army remained invisible. Every time Napoleon believed he had cornered them, his scouts returned with the same report: they have retreated again. Campfires still warm, wool ruts still fresh, but the soldiers themselves gone, like shadows disappearing into the forests. The French began calling them ghosts, enemies who left only smoke and ashes behind. Napoleon drove his men harder, ordering long forced marches trying to catch an enemy who refused to be caught. His marshals urged him to slow down. They warned him that the heat, the distance, and the scorched land were killing the army faster than Russian bullets ever could. But Napoleon dismissed them. He needed a decisive battle, and he was convinced Russia would eventually have to give him one. The Russian command, however, had already chosen its strategy. They would trade land for time, backing deeper and deeper into their vast territory. Russia had more land than Napoleon had imagination. Every kilometer the French advanced stretched their supply lines thinner, separated their corps farther apart, and pushed them into a country too large and too empty for their tactics to function. As July turned to August, hunger began to stalk the army. Villages offered nothing. Fields offered nothing. Foraging parties returned empty or didn't return at all. The men began eating unripe grain, grass boiled into tasteless mush, and eventually the meat of horses that collapsed along the way. Some tore strips of leather from saddles and softened them in boiling water. Others starved quietly, too weak to speak. Disease spread again. Typhus, dysentery, fever, silent killers that thrived in the heat and filth. Hospitals overflowed. Wounded men were left behind in villages that would later burn. The army that had marched into Russia like a machine began to dissolve into something slower, weaker, chaotic. Yet the advance continued because Napoleon believed the Russians would make a stand at Smolensk. He convinced himself that the city would be the turning point, the moment where he would finally force the Tsar to the negotiating table. Still, the Russians retreated. They retreated not because they were weak, but because they refused to lose their army in a single blow. Napoleon wanted a short war, they intended to give him a long one. He wanted a clash of armies, they offered him a clash with distance itself. Weeks passed. The Grand Army, once the most disciplined force in Europe, now stretched across hundreds of kilometers. Some divisions marched on one road, some on another, all separated by forests, swamps, and rivers. Orders took days to arrive. Units lost contact. Men wandered off the road in search of food and never returned. A force that entered Russia united as one now moved like scattered fragments. And still Napoleon pushed on. He refused to slow down. He refused to turn back. He refused to admit that the campaign had already slipped beyond his control. Every step forward took the army deeper into a land that seemed to have no end. Then, at last, the smoke of a city appeared on the horizon. Smolensk. A Russian stronghold. A gateway to the interior. A place where Napoleon believed the Russians must finally stop running. The soldiers lifted their heads when they heard the name. Smolensk meant food, shelter, rest. A chance to fight and win. A chance to give meaning to the miles of suffering behind them. But Smolensk would not give them the victory they dreamed of. It would give them something far more dangerous, a false sense of hope. The distant haze over the horizon thickened as the Grand Army approached Smolensk. What began as a faint smudge of gray soon grew into towers of smoke rising from the ancient city's walls. Soldiers, exhausted and starving after weeks of marching through empty countryside, whispered the name with a mixture of hope and dread. Smolensk meant battle, but battle meant food, shelter, and purpose. The endless march would finally break. They believed victory here would vindicate every hardship they had endured. Napoleon believed the same. To him, Smolensk was the gateway to the heart of Russia, an obstacle that, once smashed, would force the Tsar to negotiate. He expected a swift victory, the usual devastating artillery preparation, a rapid infantry assault, the Russians breaking before sunset, and the city falling cleanly into his hands. But Russia had prepared something different. This time, the Russian army did not disappear into the forests. This time, they stood their ground behind the thick stone walls of Smolensk. The city, one of the oldest in the Russian Empire, was a fortress perched on a hill above the Dnieper River. Its high bastions and narrow streets made it a perfect defensive position. And Alexander's generals intended to use every advantage it offered. When French scouts returned with news of Russian troops inside the city, Napoleon's frustration evaporated. At last, he thought, the battle I have waited for. At last, the Russians will face me. He ordered the army into position. The streets leading to Smolensk filled with French infantry, men who had marched for weeks without bread, who had eaten boiled grass and strips of horsehide, now tightening their grips on muskets. Artillery officers scrambled to place their cannons on rising ground. Drummers beat the familiar rhythm of battle, stirring tired hearts. The soldiers believed that victory would change everything. They did not yet understand that the Battle of Smolensk would only deepen their suffering. When the French cannons opened fire, the roar shook the earth. The magnificent stone walls of Smolensk caught the bombardment like a drum, echoing each explosion back across the countryside. Buildings inside the city burst into flames. Wooden roofs collapsed. Smoke rolled through the streets like a storm cloud. Yet the Russians did not break. They waited. Hours passed. The fire grew hotter. The city burned brighter. But the Russians still did not abandon their positions. Napoleon, expecting weakness, ordered assaults on the city gates and the outlying suburbs. French infantry advanced through streets choked with debris and fire, fighting hand-to-hand against Russian musketeers who appeared and vanished within the smoke. The battle raged like this for hours, chaotic, brutal, exhausting. Men fought not in tidy lines but in swirling, desperate knots. Muskets were fired so hot they scorched the hands holding them. The wounded crawled through burning alleys only to be crushed under collapsing walls or smothered by falling ash. Horses reared and screamed as the flames spread across the city, their shadows thrown monstrously across the inferno. Still the Russians held. It became clear that they had no intention of letting the French take the city easily. Smolensk was more than a strategic position, it was a symbol, a line in the sand, a first test of Napoleon's resolve. If the French wanted it, they would have to bleed for it. By evening, the heat from the burning city became unbearable. French soldiers stumbled back from the walls, faces black with soot, uniforms singed, lungs scorched by smoke. The air vibrated with the sound of crackling wood, falling stone, and musket fire echoing through narrow streets. Yet Smolensk still stood. And the Russians still resisted. Napoleon, unwilling to accept stalemate, ordered renewed assaults throughout the night. More men charged into the inferno. More bodies fell in the rubble. More blood soaked the ancient stones. But the Russians continued to withdraw in a controlled, disciplined way, fighting just enough to wound the French, then slipping away before they could be surrounded. At dawn the next day, Napoleon finally entered Smolensk. What he saw was not victory. It was devastation. The city was a skeleton. Entire districts had turned to ash. Corpses, both French and Russian, lay unburied in heaps. Smoke still rose from collapsed homes, twisted beams, and shattered churches. The streets were so choked with debris that horses could not pass. And worst of all, the Russian army was gone. As soon as Napoleon's troops had breached the defenses, the Russians had quietly slipped out along the eastern road, withdrawing toward Moscow. The French had captured nothing of value except ruins. No massive enemy losses. No decisive collapse. No surrender. Just another empty space, only this time, filled with fire. The men who had pinned their hopes on Smolensk were crushed. They had fought through fire expecting rest, food, and supplies. Instead, they found only destruction. Whatever grain or livestock the city might once have held had already been removed or burned by the retreating Russians. Napoleon himself was forced to confront an unsettling truth. He had won the city, but he had not won the campaign. He had expected Smolensk to finally bring Alexander to the negotiating table. Instead, the Tsar's forces continued eastward, still refusing to give the decisive battle Napoleon craved. The emperor's frustration grew. He had advanced too far to turn back, and yet, victory remained elusive. The marshals urged caution. They begged him to stop the campaign at Smolensk, fortify the city, and winter there where supply lines might still be salvageable. Napoleon refused. He believed that turning back would be seen as weakness, and weakness would unravel his entire empire. And so, against the advice of the men who knew the truth of the suffering around them, Napoleon chose to push deeper into Russia. Toward Moscow. The soldiers marched again, leaving behind the smoldering bones of Smolensk. But something vital had changed. Their hope, thin as it was, had burned away with the city. The march ahead felt heavier, darker, more uncertain. In silence, the Grand Army stepped into the eastern road, the same road the Russians had used to escape. It was a road that led them into even greater danger, deeper emptiness, and toward a confrontation that would scar the earth itself. The next great collision was no longer avoidable. The Russians would make their final stand. And Napoleon would meet them. At Borodino. After leaving the smoldering ruins of Smolensk behind, the Grand Army marched east in grim silence. The men no longer spoke of quick victories or of returning home before winter. They walked with hollow eyes, boots torn to ribbons, bellies gnawing from hunger. Every step carried them deeper into a vast and hostile land, one that seemed determined to break them inch by inch. Yet Napoleon pushed forward. Ahead lay Moscow, the ancient heart of Russia. He believed that taking the city would force the Tsar to negotiate, and that the war would end before the cold returned. But between the French and Moscow stood the Russian army, no longer retreating, no longer seeking distance. After months of yielding ground, the Russians were finally prepared to fight. The news spread quickly through the French camp. The enemy was forming battle lines on the fields near a small village called Borodino. Soldiers who had nearly forgotten what a real battle looked like now felt a jolt of something electric, fear mingled with anticipation. This was what Napoleon had wanted since June. His marshals felt it too, a massive confrontation unlike any they had faced in Russia. The approach to Borodino was eerie. French scouts reported the sight of thousands of Russian soldiers digging trenches, building earthworks, raising redoubts, fortified gun platforms, across rolling fields and forested ridges. They were preparing for a stand, a deliberate one. Napoleon rode forward to survey the field. The morning mist lifted slowly, revealing a sprawling network of Russian fortifications stretching across the landscape. At the center of the line loomed the Great Redoubt, an earthen fortress bristling with cannons, its walls thick enough to swallow artillery fire. Thousands of Russian infantry waited behind it, motionless, as if carved from stone. The Russians had not chosen Borodino for beauty or symbolic meaning. They had chosen it for blood. The night before the battle, French soldiers lay on the damp ground listening to distant chanting from the Russian side. Priests walked among their troops, blessing icons, waving incense, offering prayers. Thousands of Russian soldiers crossed themselves in the dim light, preparing for what many believed would be their final day on earth. On the French side, there was no singing, no praying, only exhaustion. They sharpened bayonets, checked muskets, and stared into the darkness, waiting for dawn. Then, as the first pale light crept over the fields, Napoleon gave the order. The battle began. The French artillery opened fire with a thunder that shook the ground. Dozens of cannons hurled iron into the Russian lines. The Russians answered immediately, their guns roaring from behind earthworks. The air filled with smoke so thick it clung to the earth like fog. Men fired blindly into the haze, relying on sound rather than sight. Horses screamed. Officers shouted. The sky darkened with powder and dust. French infantry advanced through the smoke toward the Russian positions, but every step brought them into a storm of musket fire. Entire ranks fell in seconds. Yet they continued forward. Napoleon had ordered a full frontal assault, no clever maneuvers, no flanking attacks, no tricks of the battlefield. The plan was brutally simple: crush the Russian line by force. The fight for the Bagration flèches, 3 arrow-shaped earthworks on the Russian left, became a horror show of repeated attacks and counterattacks. French soldiers charged uphill under a hail of bullets, seized the first earthwork, only to be thrown out by a Russian bayonet charge. They charged again, and again, bodies piling on the slopes, blood soaking the soil. Control of the flèches changed hands repeatedly, each time at staggering cost. Further north, the Great Redoubt dominated the battlefield like a massive sleeping beast. Napoleon watched it, knowing that capturing the redoubt would break the Russian center. He sent wave after wave of infantry and cavalry toward its walls. Each wave was shattered. French cuirassiers, proud heavy cavalry, charged directly into its guns, only to vanish in explosions of earth and iron. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, illuminating a battlefield that looked like the mouth of hell. Smoke turned the sky gray. Trees were shattered. Fields were torn open by cannonballs. Tens of thousands of men lay wounded or dead. The wounded cried out in dozens of languages: French, Polish, German, Italian, Dutch, calling for water, for help, for God, for home. And still the battle raged. By early afternoon, Napoleon's marshals urged him to commit the Imperial Guard, his elite reserve, undefeated in battle. A single charge by the Guard could smash the Russian line and deliver a decisive victory. But Napoleon hesitated. The Guard was his last untouched force, the core of his empire's military power. If he risked them and they fell, everything could collapse. So he refused. He would not spend them. Not here. Not yet. Instead, he allowed the battle to continue as a slugging match, a test of endurance rather than genius. Late in the day, after hours of slaughter, the French finally seized the Great Redoubt in a brutal assault led by cavalry and infantry pouring into the gun pits. Russian cannons were turned, crews bayonet, the walls overrun. For a moment, the French believed they had won. But the Russians did not break. Even without their fortifications, they reformed their battered ranks and fell back slowly, step by step, fighting with a ferocity that stunned the exhausted French. The field was theirs, but the victory was hollow. By evening, the guns fell silent. Napoleon surveyed the battlefield. What he saw chilled him. The ground was carpeted with bodies, over 70,000 men killed or wounded in a single day. No battle in the Napoleonic Wars had ever reached such carnage. The French had taken the field, but the Russian army still lived. It had slipped back toward Moscow, bloodied but not destroyed. Napoleon had won the battle. But he had not won the war. And he had paid an unimaginable price. The road from Borodino to Moscow was lined with the wreckage of an army that had given everything. The survivors marched through fields still stained with blood, past shattered trees and burned villages that seemed to reflect their own condition, broken, exhausted, hollowed out by fire. The roar of battle was behind them, but its echo followed at their heels. Every man knew that the price of reaching Moscow had been almost unbearable. Yet when the domes and spires of the great city finally appeared on the horizon, rising from the golden haze of late summer, a murmur spread through the ranks. Moscow, holy Moscow, ancient Moscow, the heart of Russia. The soldiers believed this was the end. They believed the sight of the city meant rest, food, shelter, and above all, peace. Napoleon believed the same. A city like Moscow could not fall without consequence. Surely Alexander would surrender now. As the Grand Army approached the gates, they were met not by defenders, but by silence. No cannon fire. No muskets. No resistance. The Russians had withdrawn once again, leaving minimal forces to skirmish and slow the French advance. It was not a defense, it was an invitation. Napoleon entered the city on September 14, 1812. He expected crowds, perhaps defiant, perhaps fearful, perhaps desperate, but crowds nonetheless. Instead, he rode into streets as empty as the villages he'd passed earlier in the campaign. Wooden houses stood silent. Market stalls were abandoned. Churches were shut. The windows of merchant homes stared back at him like dark, hollow eyes. Moscow was deserted. Of its 270,000 inhabitants, barely 10,000 remained, and most of those were beggars, convicts, or the elderly, those too poor or too sick to flee. The aristocrats, the merchants, the craftsmen, the civil authorities, they had all vanished ahead of the French, obeying an imperial decree to abandon the city rather than let it become a trophy in Napoleon's hands. For the first time in the campaign, Napoleon felt a flicker of unease. He could take cities. He could not take people who refused to be conquered. Still, he set up headquarters in the Kremlin and waited for the Tsar's surrender. He believed that prestige and tradition would force Alexander's hand. After all, Moscow was sacred, burning with centuries of history, religion, culture, and national pride. He underestimated how far the Russians were willing to go. That night, as the French settled in, strange reports circulated. Fires had started in districts far from one another, first a small blaze near the marketplace, then flames rising from wooden warehouses, then an entire street catching fire as if ignited by invisible hands. At first the French believed the fires accidental. Cities of wood burn easily. But soon the wind picked up. And the fires grew. Within hours, Moscow was an inferno. Flames poured from windows and crawled up rooftops. Whole alleys transformed into tunnels of fire. Explosions rocked the city as stores of gunpowder ignited. The wind roared like a living beast, sweeping the flames from one district to another with terrifying speed. Napoleon rushed from the Kremlin to a vantage point overlooking the rooftops. What he saw stunned him. The entire city was burning. He stared in disbelief as towers collapsed, spires crumbled, and whole blocks vanished into glowing seas of fire. The sky glowed orange, as if dawn had come hours too soon. Sparks rained through the air like fiery snow. Smoke turned the horizon black. This was no accident. This was a deliberate sacrifice. Russian police, arson squads, and even criminals released from prisons had been ordered to set the city ablaze. Barrels of tar had been hidden in basements. Fuses stretched beneath wooden floors. Fire was the final weapon Russia would wield, one that could not be defeated by cavalry charges or artillery. Napoleon watched as victory turned to ash. The heat grew so intense near the Kremlin that the French were forced to evacuate parts of the fortress. Soldiers fled through streets that had become rivers of fire. Desperate, they smashed doors open searching for shelter only to find flames already devouring the interiors. Horses panicked and bolted. Wagons toppled. Looters carrying stolen gowns, rugs, or furniture dropped them in the streets as burning embers fell on their backs. The French army had marched thousands of miles, fought the bloodiest battle of their age, captured the greatest city in Russia, and now found themselves trapped inside a blazing furnace. For 4 days, Moscow burned. It was the greatest urban fire in European history before the World Wars. When the flames finally died, 2/3 of the city had been destroyed. The French walked through ruins that smelled of ash and death. Blackened timbers jutted from the earth like skeletons. Churches that once glittered with gold were now charred shells. Entire neighborhoods had collapsed into smoking pits. Napoleon walked among the ruins, his boots crunching on glass and cinders. He had expected triumph, he found desolation. He had expected negotiations, he received silence. Alexander did not surrender. He did not write. He did not acknowledge Napoleon's presence in Moscow at all. Instead, the Tsar sent a message not with words, but with flame. Napoleon had conquered nothing. The emperor remained in Moscow for more than a month, waiting for a peace offer that would never come. His generals warned him, the supply lines were falling apart, winter was approaching, and every day lost meant more soldiers starving in the streets or dying in hospitals. No wagons arrived. No food came. The army weakened, then withered. And then snow fell for the first time. Just a thin dusting, a warning of what was coming. Napoleon knew what it meant, even if he didn't admit it aloud. He could not stay in Moscow. He could not advance deeper into Russia. He had only one choice left. He had to retreat. The march out of Moscow would become one of the most tragic journeys in military history, one that would break the Grand Army completely and echo through Europe for generations. But first, Napoleon had to leave the city he had taken only to watch it burn beneath his feet. On October 19, 1812, the Grand Army marched out of Moscow. No drums. No music. No triumph. Just silence. Soldiers looked over their shoulders at the ruins of the city they had come so far to take. Behind them, Moscow smoldered like a dying star. Ahead of them lay a road that would become the graveyard of their army. Winter was coming. Supplies were gone. Hunger was already tightening its grip. And the Russians were waiting. What began as a retreat would soon turn into a nightmare beyond anything the French had yet endured. On October 19, 1812, the Grand Army marched out of Moscow in a silence that felt heavier than cannon fire. Snowflakes drifted through the air, soft at first, almost gentle, a faint whisper of the storm that was gathering. The soldiers tightened their worn coats and pulled rags over their hands, but nothing could stop the chill creeping into their bones. They were leaving behind a ruined city, but they had no idea they were walking into an even greater ruin. What awaited them on the road west was not just winter, it was annihilation. The retreat began with discipline. Columns formed neatly, officers barking orders, drums tapping out steady rhythms. Napoleon intended to march south to Kaluga, where untouched farmlands and supplies might offer salvation. But the Russians knew his plan. General Kutuzov blocked the southern route with a fresh army waiting to finish what Moscow had begun. Napoleon realized too late that the Russians were not simply chasing him, they were hurting him. Forced to abandon the southern path, the Grand Army turned back toward the route they had used to enter Russia. It was the same road that had already been stripped bare during the advance, the same villages burned, the same fields plundered, the same empty wells and lifeless forests. The soldiers marched into land that had nothing left to give. Within days, the retreat began to unravel. Food ran out. Discipline crumbled. Men collapsed from exhaustion. At first they dropped out of the line one by one, an officer here, a drummer boy there. But soon they fell in groups. Some lay down just for a moment, promising themselves they would stand again, but the cold wrapped around them like a blanket and they never moved. The frost killed quietly. The horses began to die next. Thousands of them, beautiful cavalry mounts, wagon pullers, and artillery draft animals, fell in the snow, unable to go on. When they collapsed, the starving men rushed to butcher them. Knives hacked through hide, steam rising from the still warm flesh. Soldiers cooked strips of meat over tiny fires hidden behind rocks to avoid drawing Russian scouts. The fires often gave them away anyway. Cossacks began circling the retreat like wolves. They appeared suddenly from the treelanes on fast, nimble horses, swooping down on stragglers with lances and sabers before vanishing again into the woods. They did not attack the main body, their strategy was far crueler. They hunted the weak, the sick, the lost, the ones who could no longer keep pace. Every day, the number of stragglers grew. Desperate men wandered off frozen roads in search of food that did not exist. Some broke open abandoned houses only to find empty rooms and snow drifting across the floors. Others died with grass still frozen between their teeth. By early November, the temperature plummeted. What had begun as light snow now became a howling blizzard. The icy wind tore at clothing, freezing sweat into armor like shells around the men's bodies. Muskets became useless as metal parts froze solid. Fingers blackened. Toes turned waxy and numb. Men who couldn't keep moving turned into statues overnight. The French soldiers, once the most feared in Europe, began to look like shadows. Their coats were stiff with ice. Their shoes disintegrated. Their faces were swollen and cracked. Some wrapped themselves in women's shawls looted from Moscow. Others tied rags around their heads, looking more like beggars than soldiers. Day after day, night after night, they marched through a frozen wilderness with no end in sight. They were not retreating from Moscow anymore. They were retreating from death, and death was faster. Napoleon tried to maintain order. He rode along the column in a sleigh, face grim, layered in furs, watching an army that no longer resembled the one he had led into Russia. His guards marched beside him, still disciplined, still strong, but even they were beginning to bend under the cold. The emperor had hoped to inspire them. Instead, the men stared at him with hollow eyes. Their faith in him had not vanished, but something more primal had taken its place: survival. Every decision mattered now. Every hour lost meant hundreds more dead. Every detour risked disaster. But fate offered no mercy. On November 9th, the temperature dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. The cold was so sharp that soldiers reported hearing trees crack like gunshots in the night. Bread froze solid. Wine froze. Ink froze. Even brandy turned thick and slushy. Men huddled in groups to share the warmth of dying fires, whispering prayers or muttering deliriously. Many never woke up. Napoleon pressed onward, pushing toward the Berezina River, hoping to cross before Russian forces could trap him against the freezing water. But the Russian army was closing in from every side: Kutuzov from the south, Wittgenstein from the north, Shishagov from the west. The French retreat was no longer a march. It was a race. And the road was paved with corpses. Cannons were abandoned because horses could no longer pull them. Wagons carrying wounded men were left behind. Entire divisions disappeared. Some froze standing upright, their hands still gripping their muskets. Others staggered from the road and fell face first into the snow, never rising again. The retreat became a nightmare no soldier could forget. Starving men robbed each other for scraps of food. Some fought like animals over the last piece of horse meat. Others silently wasted away, their legs too weak to carry them any farther. Children traveling with the army, drummer boys, sons of officers, camp followers, perished alongside the soldiers. The snow swallowed them all. As the Grand Army neared the Berezina River, the sound of distant cannon fire echoed across the frozen plains. The Russians were closing in. Napoleon knew that if he did not cross the river, his entire army would be destroyed in a trap. Ahead lay a river swollen with ice, flanked by enemy forces, with no bridge in sight. Behind lay tens of thousands of corpses frozen into the landscape. The French soldiers staggered toward the Berezina like survivors of a natural disaster, alive, but barely human. They had survived hunger, frostbite, storms, disease, and Cossack raids. But the worst moment of the retreat was still to come, waiting at the riverbank like a final judgment. By the time the remnants of the Grand Army staggered toward the Berezina River, they were barely an army at all. They were a mass of broken men, gaunt, frostbitten, half-starved, dragging themselves forward through snow crusted with the bodies of those who had fallen along the way. The sound of Russian artillery in the distance echoed like a death knell. Napoleon knew he was running out of time. If the Russians reached the river before he could cross, the Grand Army would be trapped and destroyed. The Berezina itself was a cruel obstacle. It was late November, and the river churned thick with ice, swollen from melting snow farther upstream. It wasn't frozen solid enough to walk across, but the ice was heavy enough to destroy any weak bridge. The French arrived expecting to find a crossing point, but what greeted them instead was a landscape of disaster. The river's banks were steep, the water dangerously fast, and all existing bridges had been destroyed by Russian engineers. On the opposite bank lay freedom, Lithuania, Poland, and the last hope of escape. Between the French and that salvation stood the river, the cold, and three Russian armies closing in like jaws. Napoleon had never faced a moment so desperate. But amid the ruin of his army, one group still held its discipline, the Dutch engineers of General Jean-Baptiste Ebel. These men had been ordered months earlier to burn their heavy bridge-building equipment to lighten the baggage train. Disobeying orders, they kept some of the tools and materials. It was their quiet act of defiance that would now save thousands of lives. Napoleon ordered Ebel to build bridges at once. The engineers began their impossible work. The river water was icy enough to kill a man in minutes. Yet the engineers waded in up to their chests, anchoring beams, hauling chains, driving stakes into mud that numbed their legs instantly. They worked without rest, hands bleeding, breath turning to ice in the frigid air. Some collapsed into the water and never resurfaced. But slowly, miraculously, the bridges began to rise. As the bridges neared completion, the situation worsened. Russian forces were closing in from both sides. On the north bank, General Wittgenstein's army approached with fresh soldiers and steady supplies. To the south, Admiral Shishagov advanced with tens of thousands of troops. Kutuzov, moving more slowly, was close enough to send skirmishers to harass the French rear. The Grand Army was being swallowed from every direction. Napoleon made a bold decision. To deceive the Russians, he sent a feint southward, a false buildup of troops to suggest he intended to cross downstream. Shishagov took the bait and moved his forces toward the decoy site. This single miscalculation by the Russians gave Napoleon his only chance. At dawn on November 26, the first bridge was ready. It swayed dangerously in the icy water, but it held long enough for the French to begin crossing. Napoleon ordered the infantry and artillery across first, but panic erupted almost immediately. Cannon fire rumbled from the Treline as Russian forces discovered the rail crossing and rushed to stop it. The French troops fought fiercely to protect the bridgehead. Artillery thundered across the white, frozen plains. Smoke mixed with snow. Musket fire echoed against the river's banks. The wounded were dragged through the snow to makeshift shelters, some dying in the arms of comrades as they awaited their turn to cross. Thousands crowded along the banks, soldiers, officers, women, children, merchants, camp followers. They pushed and jostled in desperation. Every explosion from Russian cannons sent screams rippling through the masses. Some fell into the river and were swept away beneath the ice. Others were trampled underfoot as the crowd surged. Still, the French fought on. Still, the engineers held the bridges together with bare hands and sheer will. The second bridge, built for wagons and artillery, finally opened. Supply carts, cannons, and wounded soldiers rolled across, the wood creaking under the tremendous weight. Some wagons tipped and crashed into the river. Horses reared and screamed as they slipped on frozen planks. But the crossing continued, hour after hour. On the afternoon of November 27, Napoleon himself crossed the Berezina. Wrapped in furs, face hardened by exhaustion and despair, he paused on the far bank to watch the remnants of his army still struggling to escape. Behind him, the battlefield raged, the desperate stand that would allow the core of his forces to survive. Marshal Ney, ever the rearguard commander, fought like a man possessed, directing troops, firing muskets personally, refusing to retreat until the last possible moment. For Ney, honor meant nothing if it didn't mean protecting the men he commanded. All night and into the next day, the crossing continued. But time was running out. By the morning of November 28, the French had managed to push the Russians back long enough for the majority of the army to cross. But on the near bank, thousands of stragglers still waited. They were wounded soldiers, starving civilians, even children clinging to mothers wrapped in rags. Their eyes were hollow, their faces gray from hunger and cold. As Russian forces closed in, the panic reached its breaking point. The engineers, those same heroic men who had built the bridges, begged the stragglers to cross faster. But it was too late. Wittgenstein's artillery had moved within range. Russian shells began to fall directly onto the crowd. The ground burst into fire and ice. Men were torn apart. Women screamed for their children. The bridges shook violently. Napoleon had no choice left. At midday, a new order was given. Burn the bridges. If they remained standing even minutes longer, the Russians would flood across and destroy the survivors on the far bank. The engineers, tears freezing on their cheeks, lit the charges. Flames climbed the wooden beams. The bridges shuddered, cracked, and collapsed into the freezing river. Thousands still on the far bank were trapped. Some threw themselves into the water, trying to swim across. The current swallowed them instantly. Others fled into the forest, only to be cut down by Cossacks. The scenes on the riverbank defied imagination: chaos, despair, and slaughter. But the Grand Army, what was left of it, had escaped. By the evening of November 29, the survivors marched west in silence. They did not cheer. They did not speak. They only walked, numb and hollow, knowing they had lived through an ordeal that had swallowed hundreds of thousands of their comrades. When Napoleon had marched into Russia, he had commanded over 600,000 soldiers, the largest army Europe had ever seen. When he left, fewer than 40,000 remained capable of fighting. The retreat from Moscow became a symbol across the continent, not of glory, but of the fragility of power, the cost of ambition, and the terrible indifference of nature and war. Napoleon would never again command an army so vast. He would never again rule Europe unquestioned. The Berezina had ended not just a campaign, but an empire's illusion of invincibility. And for those who survived, the memory of that frozen river, of ice, fire, suffering, and courage, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And so, from the banks of the Berezina River to the endless snows of Russia, the Grand Army's march came to an end, not with the triumph Napoleon promised, but with the silence of a shattered empire. Hundreds of thousands had crossed into Russia filled with confidence, ambition, and hope. Only a fraction returned, carrying memories so painful they would never speak of them again. What began as the greatest military campaign in European history ended as a catastrophe that reshaped the world. Napoleon's invasion of Russia revealed a truth older than war itself, that no matter how powerful a leader becomes, no matter how unstoppable an army may seem, nature, time, and human resilience cannot be conquered by force. The frozen roads of 1812 became the graveyard of an empire, and the birth of a legend. A legend of endurance, sacrifice, miscalculation, and survival. A legend that continues to echo across history. If this journey moved you, if it opened your eyes to the human cost behind the stories we think we know, then explore the rest of our historical documentaries. There are more truths to uncover, more forgotten voices to hear, and more lessons hidden in the shadows of time. Thank you for watching. And remember, history is not just what happened. It is what survived.